that frustration when it hit? What were you going through at that moment? What point did you come to more of a cognitive, or was it an emotional impact that it had on you than to just shift gears?
I think there's sort of two things at work. One is my increased confidence in myself that I was really good at the work that I did. And then along with that, just an increasing frustration that, the school I was working at, didn't reward, right, that competence, that expertise in compensation, or right in a sort of a title change. One of the challenges in education in general is that it doesn't have the same kind of advancement structure that other fields have if you don't want to move into the pure administration side, being an assistant principal, a principal. If all you want to do is be a classroom teacher, it. Right. And if you don't have a desire to be a department chair, right, there's nowhere to go. And once you're at a really elite school, and I certainly was working at an elite school, right, that's the top. And so while certainly in my role in the college office, there was a little bit more of a hierarchical structure in the sense that there are directors of college offices and then everybody else who does the work. It was this real sense of like, I know how to do this. How come this school can't recognize that in a way that feels right, meaningful, both from a financial sense and then also right, a title sense? As it became clearer that, okay, I need to be stepping away from this, there was a real sense of disappointment that the school, like from my perspective, didn't care, right, that they were losing me.
Welcome to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. I'm Nick Michael. There are some pivots that happen all at once, and then there are the ones that build slowly, quietly, over time, long before anything actually changes on the outside. This is one of those stories. It's the kind of experience where, from the outside, everything looks solid. A long career, a clear role, a sense of direction that most people spend years trying to find. The kind of path that once you're on it, you're expected to stay on. And for a long time, that was true. Years spent in education, teaching, advising, guiding students and families through one of the most important decisions of their lives. Meaningful work, impactful work, the kind of work that becomes part of your identity. But internally, something had been shifting, because there's a difference between being good at something and feeling aligned with it. And when that gap starts to open up, it doesn't usually happen all at once. It shows up gradually, in the energy it takes just to get through the day, in the feeling that something that used to fit doesn't quite fit anymore. And that tension between competence and alignment, between stability and truth, is really at the heart of what we explore on Pivot Point Strategy for Change. Because this isn't just about leaving a job. It's about what happens when you realize that no amount of effort inside the same system is going to give you what you're actually looking for. And that if something is going to change, it's not going to come from waiting. It's going to come from you. And eventually, that realization leads to a different kind of question. Not what's the next opportunity, but what would it look like to build something on my own terms? So today's conversation is about that shift. What it takes to move from structure to ownership, from being part of a system to creating something yourself, and what you have to confront internally in order to do that. My guest today is Darren Myers, founder of Myers Advising, who now works directly with students and families, helping them navigate the college process in a way that's far more personal, intentional, and aligned with the way he believes this work should be done. Welcome, Darren. It's a privilege and a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you for having me on.
And Darren, as you know, on this podcast, we focus on a specific pivot point, but if there are other moments that feel important, we can always continue the conversation in the future episodes. So let me start here. When you think about a meaningful pivot point in your life, Can you walk us through that experience? And as you do, I'd love for you to frame it through the lens of what we talk about on this podcast. What was the first signal that something needed to change? Was it more of a cognitive realization or an emotional shift or even something you felt physically? And how did that awareness eventually lead you to take action?
So when I think about sort of the steps that got me to where I am in this sort of moment as being a small business owner and working for myself rather than within the context of working at a school, there's sort of two pivot moments. The first one happened about a decade or so ago when I recognized that while I really was, and I guess one could say still am, right, an excellent physics teacher, I found the fact that high school physics doesn't change. While physics certainly does, the frontiers of physics are ever expanding our knowledge and understanding of how things work, particularly in the field of cosmology. But introductory high school physics hasn't changed. The bulk of it, right, was developed by Newton in the 17th century. So while I could recognize the rhythms of the curriculum, what students would find hard, I had a lot of trouble making the leap, which my colleagues who'd spent their lives in the classroom had told me was sort of necessary to stay a classroom teacher, which is sort of to be able to inhabit the minds of your students. I found that really hard. I could anticipate what they would find challenging, what they would find difficult, but I had trouble accessing why they found those things difficult. And I was sort of lucky and fortunate that at the time, the administration of the school that I was working at was comfortable with sort of part-time college counselors. And the woman who was the director of the college office at the time liked the idea of the part-time college counselor. And so there was an opening and I was given an opportunity sort of on a small scale, beginning to work with about 10 or 11 students to begin to transition into the college counseling office. At the time, there was an older member of the office who was kind of making his transition towards retirement, and as his caseload was lowered, mine increased, such that after 2 years, I then kind of shifted full-time in the college office. And in the college office, I found and recognized that sort of search for inhabiting the minds of my students wasn't such a daunting challenge anymore, because of the community that I grew up in, which really did emphasize, where one went to college after high school. My own college process and experience of applying to college still resonates with me. I have a lot of really kind of vivid memories, right, from when I was 17 and 18 years old and contemplating where I was going to go after high school. And so because of that, I feel like I'm able to connect with my students in a genuine way, because that moment that they're experiencing now, right, I still carry with me some, I guess now, 30 plus years later. And so the more recent transition from the school to working for myself grew much more slowly. I think my wife, in her wisdom, sort of recognized that while things were comfortable remaining in the school, they weren't necessarily what was best for me. And it took a while for me to make that realization myself. The first was I sort of had a sense that I was lucky, right, to be doing the role that I was, and that if I wasn't at the particular school I was at, I wouldn't be able to continue doing the work. By and large, because I myself never worked right, in college admissions. I was never a college admissions officer. I'd volunteered with my alma mater to do like alumni interviews, but that's not the same as traveling the country, recruiting students to apply, and then of course reading those applications in depth. And so for a long time, I felt like I was at a deficit because I'd never worked admissions. And then, private school closer to our home had an opening. I applied. They were very excited to see me apply. Ultimately, right, it didn't go forward because I felt like the compensation wasn't where, I needed it to be. But that interview process essentially confirmed that my wife was right, was that my experience, would be valued by other people. It wasn't just luck. I didn't need to stay where I was in order to continue doing this work. And then little did I know at the time, but that's sort of when kind of the unraveling, I guess, of the faith that I had in the school that I was working at with, began. And through what was happening within our own office with former colleagues of mine being terminated, and sort of the reactions to that, and then talking with sort of headhunters, it really became clear to me that the school that I was working at the time sort of undervalued folks who were in positions that I had in the college office, which I think personally was like ill-defined. We're much closer to be having faculty positions than administrative positions, but nonetheless, you're sort of defined as administrators. And over the course of the last 3 years that I was at the school, it became much clearer to me that I wasn't going to be the husband I wanted to be. I wasn't going to be the father that I wanted to be if I stayed where I was, because so much energy was put in putting out, an image, a front, if you will, that everything was okay and everything was great with the students I worked with and their families, that I came home really tired and wasn't as patient as I needed to be with my kids and my wife. And while I certainly did an exhaustive search to try to do the same job at another school, I'd waited too long. I had too much experience, and it wasn't economically viable for those other schools to hire somebody like myself. Way better to hire somebody who's coming off the admission side of things, who would see the salary as a lower salary than what I was looking for, right, as way better than what they had. And there's few opportunities to lead an office. Sort of recognize that, like, I learned enough over the past decade that I could really organize the whole experience. And so, while the security of working in a school and having colleagues to turn to is certainly something that I miss, I knew I could do it. And so 6 years ago, I had sort of set up Myers Advising as this sort of small little side project that I didn't really do anything with, because I was, fearful that if any of the parents at the school I was working at found it, they could lodge a complaint that how come he's spending time doing this, he's not spending enough time with my kid. So by and large, it really didn't focus on it until this summer, because I left the school I was at the end of the academic year.
You're listening to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. If today's conversation resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It truly helps others find the show and supports the work we're doing here. You can find Pivot Point Strategy for Change on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like a deeper dive into the work we explore on the show, I invite you to visit my Substack page, where I share in-depth articles and reflections. So you've made quite a shift in a couple of aspects of your life, yet staying within the education field. I'm wondering, that frustration when it hit, what were you going through at that moment? What point did you come to more of a cognitive, or was it an emotional impact that it had on you, than to just shift gears? I'm curious about that time period.
Yeah, I think any institution, but perhaps, schools in particular, are really slow to change. And then when they do change, right, those changes are so small and incremental that when they're happening, it's pretty easy to overlook them. They feel wrong in the moment, but then you get used to what that new normal is, and things still feel pretty close to the way they were. But over the course of 20 years, all those incremental changes really did add up, so that in my last couple of years at the school, it no longer felt like the school I first started working at 2 decades prior to that. And so I think there's sort of two things at work. One is my increased confidence in myself that I was really good at the work that I did. And then along with that, just an increasing frustration that, the school I was working at, didn't reward, right, that competence, that expertise in compensation, or right in a sort of a title change. One of the challenges in education in general is that it doesn't have the same kind of advancement structure that other fields have if you don't want to move into the pure administration side, being an assistant principal, a principal. If all you want to do is be a classroom teacher, right? And if you don't have, a desire to be a department chair, right, there's nowhere to go. And once you're at a really elite school, and I certainly was working at an elite school, right, that's the top. And so while certainly in my role in the college office, there was a little bit more of a hierarchical structure in the sense that there are directors of college offices and then everybody else who does the work. It was this real sense of like, I know how to do this. How come this school can't recognize that in a way that feels right, meaningful, both from a financial sense and then also right, a title sense? And it was just as it became clearer that, okay, I need to be stepping away from this, there was a real sense of disappointment that the school, like from my perspective, didn't care, right, that they were losing me. And while I'd seen plenty of other people, go, and the institution survives the people that make it, when it's you, right, there is sort of this sense that like you'd want them to kind of fight to keep you. And they weren't really interested in doing that.
I was going to ask about that in particular, but first I was going to say, was there a point where when did you realize this wasn't just regular frustration, that it had crossed into something deeper that was starting to take a real emotional toll on you? At what point? I'm just curious about that. I'm always looking and I'm always curious about the cognitive and the emotional impact that overcomes people then to take the next step.
Yeah, I think, there was a moment, gosh, it was probably 2 years before ultimately I left, where a colleague who I'd known for a long time came into my office and just asked if I was okay. And so, I shared with her kind of the complexities of how things were. But I think, when other people begin to recognize, hey, something's going on, right? It makes it easier for you yourself to recognize that something's going on. And
Well, you also have to feel comfortable to share, about to
yeah,
say, right?
yeah.
And to confide in with that colleague. I know you mentioned there was a colleague who departed. So this departure, was that part of the chain of events that led you to that decision? Because I've worked places where when certain clinicians had left the hospital, anywhere else I've worked, it kind of, you start to think about what you're going to do and, is this still for me and where do I go from here? I'm
Yeah,
wondering if that
yeah, I would say,
contributed to some
yeah,
of
the
that.
departure of that colleague was particularly painful, in large part because it happened like a day or so before school started. When, as I learned more, right, the precipitating incidents had happened during the previous school year, even though, as I learned through kind of the other channels in which one learns things, the circumstances around it were really, really specious. And my colleague had done quote unquote the right thing, but then the school ultimately, from my perspective, treated her really unfairly and poorly. I can put on from the perspective of the school and being really fearful of lawsuits and all that sort of thing. And then the expedient decision was to get rid of my colleague and to not have yet another lawsuit be filed against the school from a family of a former student or whatever. But that moment definitely cast sort of a pall over the whole school year because of the way schools work, right? Oftentimes it's siloed and it's like it takes people a while to realize that somebody's not around anymore. But we knew immediately, and then we couldn't ask questions about it, we couldn't talk about it. And yes, were there reassurances that none of us were sort of at risk of the same thing happening to us, but it increased these questions like, what could I do? What might I do? Right, that would result in the same sort of thing. And so that definitely sort of created the first seed. And that certainly was the precipitating event for my colleague who was directing the office at the time to seek another opportunity. It certainly set the chain in motion of like, okay, like I need to get out of here. And initially, that job search was kind of driven out of that urgency of sort of not really yet knowing what it was I was looking for, because there's a shift that goes from, okay, I need to leave to, all right, how do I want to land? The next year, when I did a much more exhaustive search, I got better at telling my own story and understanding sort of what I wanted. And I recognized that while the financial stability piece would have been excited about sort of any kind of horizontal move, I saw that like I could run an office, and came really close at another school, but didn't get it. And I was like, you know what? I've got the support of my wife. Let me run my own office.
I'm listening and I'm trying to figure out, usually a lot of people feel that disconnect and still stay. What do you think kept you in place longer than you ultimately wanted to be?
Yeah, I think one is a sense of real connection, right, to the students that I was working with and kind of wanting to see them to the end. And also like I seen people leave our office and I knew that the kids were fine through the transition. I wasn't as up close with it because the earlier pieces sort of happened when I was kind of part-time and I was still teaching for the most part. And it didn't really resonate with me in the same sort of way that the kids and their parents are going to be just fine, right? That like I didn't need to stay for the students that I was working with to have to have a good process.
You realized that you were expendable or that your colleague was, and they moved on. You started to think about your own, where do I fit in? What was that like, realizing that shift?
It was disappointing and frustrating, because certainly, that moment when the school sort of felt like losing an excellent person was better than whatever might come with keeping them. And when my colleague who was the director at the time ultimately left, the way that process was handled really kind of doubled down on that sense of like none of us really matter. And I think that was the frustrating part, was that whoever was making those decisions like wasn't concerned about how those decisions were going to impact the day-to-day lives of the people that worked with that person or will work with the new person. And I'd heard sort of secondhand from colleagues in other departments where similar sorts of things has happened. But there's always a sense of like, oh, it can't possibly happen to us, by and large, because so many families make their decisions about which school to send their kid on based on, the work of the college office. It felt protected in the same sort of way that when I was a physics teacher, I kind of felt protected because when I was out and you would meet people, there basically sort of like three common reactions, like, oh, wow, I didn't even take physics when I was in high school, or my physics experience was excellent because I had a great teacher, or it was terrible because I had a terrible teacher. And that was kind of it. There wasn't a real sense, when you talk to people like, oh, I could be a physics teacher. Whereas in talking with my colleagues who teach history and English, there is this sense that most parents seem to convey that like, oh, I could teach history, I could teach English because I can read. Whereas there was something protective, right, about being a physics teacher, which I definitely recognized. And I think to some degree there was this sense of like, oh, I'm protected because I'm a college counselor. And those incidences really, because it wasn't someone deciding to leave because they had a partner who moved to a different part of the country or whatever. This was someone like, being fired. That really threatened that sense of safety and security.
I hear you. There's a particular kind of identity that comes with being a school-based educator. You're part of a community, a school calendar, a culture, and you were a physics teacher. The school settings I've worked in, they're highly sought after when they're available. They are swallowed up immediately. There are few compared to English. Let's be real. You're higher on the food chain.
Yeah.
I'm not, the reality is that there's a level of confidence and everyone has when they can teach calculus or physics, or the advanced math, the advanced science. And then you have the other aspect of it with doing the counseling for colleges. What was it like for you to start to recognize your value had changed in their eyes, or it could change? And you started to question. Then you started to question your own. But what was it like hearing or recognizing this?
Yeah, I think it took a while for, I guess, the fear that I couldn't do the work anywhere else to dissipate enough for me, for the frustration and, not being compensated in the ways that I felt like not just me, but my colleagues should be compensated. And that in this moment that the school is in of sort of transition, to not recognize that I was the person who'd been at the school the longest, had been in the college office the longest, and that wasn't worthy of something, was profoundly disappointing. Some of it was because at the very top levels, the senior leadership of the school was changing, but also just in conversations I would have with the senior folks, no one would talk to me in a way that indicated that they were responsible for any kind of decision, that things were out of my hands or their hands. I talked to somebody, in the head of school office, and they're like, no, that's up to your principal. And I was like, but like my principal will do what my immediate supervisor would do. Like, how come you guys all can't get in line with us on this? And that sense of kind of getting the runaround, that I think was sort of the most frustrating element of it, was that the decision makers all felt like they were incapable, or at least to me, what I was hearing was like they weren't able to make a decision that I wanted them to make, and that it felt like getting the runaround. That voice of not just wanting, but like needing to be in a place that valued me and what I do got louder and louder.
What was the hardest part about going from a really defined role inside of a system, a school, established, to having to create the structure for yourself and the work you're doing now, running your advising?
The biggest challenge is, where are my students and their families coming from, right? It's not baked into the cake of the role. There's not a built-in caseload. I have to generate my caseload. So that definitely is the most daunting element of this transition. And sort of the fact that I'm now running a business.
What does it feel like in this phase for you right now as you're still building and figuring it out? How is that for you?
It feels exciting in the sense that like I get to build it. But it's also very nerve-wracking, because the business elements of how do I get my name out there, how do I approach this, being on social media, which is something that I don't do like in quote unquote real life. Like in my personal life, I am not on social media. So recognizing like I need to be posting, on LinkedIn and Facebook, right, fairly regularly is still something I'm working my way into. And so those elements of it are challenging. Just even finding the regular rhythms of what a work day is challenging. I certainly like don't find myself missing, right, being at a school. I certainly miss my colleagues and that stuff, and I miss the energy that adolescents have, but I don't miss going to school. And even the act of packing in my office and sort of confronting, I guess I'd been in that office for like maybe 9 years. That wasn't emotionally fraught. I think by and large, because I'd been telling myself I can't keep working here for so long, that when I finally came, it was just like, okay, this is just what I need to do. I need to pack up my office. So I think the benefits that I have definitely outweigh the challenges. And then I'm learning sort of the weird kind of in fits and starts way that I get paid, because I offer my services in this sort of mix of doing it like hourly, but also in packages. And so it's that piece of it is very interesting and weird, and certainly feels not super secure right now. And so there is this a sense of real adventure to it, in that while I know the work of college counseling inside out and upside down and backwards, I certainly cannot say the same thing about running a business. And so that part of it is definitely the most nerve-wracking part of it at the moment. But because I have a smaller caseload, I can do way more for the students that I do work with, and I like that a lot.
So how do you approach balance now between work, family, and your own energy to do what you're doing compared to where you were before? And has that had an impact now?
Yes, I think I'm able to, from a physical exercise standpoint, I'm able to take care of myself better because I've got the time to do that. I certainly have more time to be, with my kids, which I like and I appreciate. I still am struggling with creating the same kind of structure that my day had when I worked in a school. But by and large, I do find that I start working at the same time every day, uh, and I kind of wind down working at the same time every day. Because once my kids come home from school, there's a pivot to getting them, to and from their activities and cooking dinner and things like that. Uh, and so I'm slowly developing what feels like a rhythm, and identifying just the benefit of kind of writing things down and keeping a set of kind of what the goals are in terms of things I want to produce, or what have you. And that part of it is exciting, and I think in the same sort of way that, like, when I was, when I the parts of the year where I had to generate a lot of work product as a college counselor, it's kind of like the summer and fall, finishing off like counselor letters. Like, I found myself like working 2 days. Like, I'd have the day of work meeting with students, and then I have a day where like I've focused on writing. And if I was in a writing mode, there was this sense, as much as I enjoyed working with my students, it's sort of the meetings got in the way of getting the work done, in the same sort of way that when I was teaching, if I was designing a new lab or whatever, and then all of a sudden I looked up and like, oh, class is starting in 5 minutes. I did put something aside, um, to go teach. There is that same sort of sense of like getting in the rhythm of something and then having to kind of put the brakes on to pivot to do something else that I kind of still struggle with. But, as I've gotten into this and sort of recognized that I have ideas about this and I can put them out there, and it sort of doesn't matter, like in the grand scheme of things, what other people think about it. If they like it and they want to check me out, great. If they like it and they don't think that, likely never know. And so there is an increased sort of confidence that what I have to say about this stuff is worth sharing.
Well said. I'm curious now. At what point did you realize you couldn't sit back and wait for opportunities to come to you and that you had to go out and build it yourself?
I think, it's,
When did that thought come up?
I mean, I guess it
Because
probably came up sort of last fall, of just sort of recognizing like I can't stay at the school. I just can't.
so
Um,
stop right there. Tell me about the emotion attached to that was brewing, that was the undertone. What was what was coming up for you? Oftentimes we act more often than not first with an emotion that sparks a thought, and then there's a cognition, and then there's a plan. And you're certainly a person who has a growth mindset, and you're not going to stay stagnant. You've reinvented yourself enough times, and then you're willing to take a chance, which is great. What was it that was happening to you emotionally that was saying, I can't stay here?
I think it was both sort of the build up recognition that, as much as I adored my colleagues and the students that I worked with, I really feel thankful for the students that I worked with and the colleagues, that I shared that experience with. But the place changed.
What changed in you, though?
I think by and large, it was the increased discomfort, right? That a recognition that continuing to work here was no longer the comfortable decision. I think that's the biggest thing. The thing that I knew, even though it changed drastically to the point where I felt like I didn't always recognize it, it got to a point where the comfortable thing had become so uncomfortable that I needed to be somewhere else. And the way schools work and the way in the how and the when in which, schools hired new folks, like I'd done a really good job putting myself out there and trying to end up in a different opportunity. And through that lens, like it didn't work out. And I was sort of very, very fortunate to be in a position, where my wife was behind this decision, sort of recognizing, hey, it's not great that we're losing that regular kind of steady income, but we can weather the time while you build this, and then can become, from a financial standpoint, more of a contributor.
Was there a moment then?
In a lot of ways now that I couldn't before, that kind of offsets some of that financial stuff? Sure.
No, I hear you. What was there a moment where you said it to yourself, if I don't make a move now, I may never make one? Did that come to your mind?
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a sense of, if I don't just get out of here, I'm going to be sort of stuck here. And so I think.
What kind of discomfort were you experiencing that you were afraid that you would be stuck with? If you can talk more about that. See, that's the emotion that mobilizes people.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was that sort of, the voice of wanting to be valued.
That's it. Appreciated?
Yeah. But like, I think it's really, it kind of ties back to sort of that compensation and title piece. I knew I was appreciated and valued, by my students and their families and my colleagues and all that sort of stuff. But like, they weren't the ones deciding what my salary was.
Exactly. Yes.
They weren't the ones deciding what my title was. And the people who were making those decisions, like, they were, at the end of the day, too reliant on that sort of sense of like, well, people want to work here, right? And they'll work here even if they're, what's increasingly felt like grossly underpaid.
Yeah.
And so I think while there still was a hesitancy on my part to really make the move, there was just a recognition that like, this isn't working for me anymore, even though I really do adore my colleagues, and so many wonderful things in my life had happened while I was working at that school that through some lens may not have happened the way they did had I been working somewhere else. But it was time to move on.
You're listening to Pivot Point, Strategy for Change. I'm Nick Michael. If today's conversation resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It truly helps others find the show and supports the work we're doing here. So when you made the decision to step away and really commit to building your own practice, what felt most at risk for you in that moment?
I think what felt most at risk was, and still feels that way, a connection to the professional community, right, that I became a part of. And I think, I was really in that sense of, I don't know, like being like a quote unquote rising star within that professional work, and having to kind of put all of that aside and really step away from it. That definitely sort of was like, if I'm grieving anything to some degree, it's that, am I part of the Professional Association of Independent Educational Consultants? Yeah, but it feels like such a new, vaster landscape than what felt like the little world that I was working in. And so I think, that's the part that I kind of miss the most.
So if I hear you, wow. If you can go back and sit with yourself a few years before the pivot, when you first started feeling that disconnect or that discomfort, what would you say to yourself? Besides, it's going to be okay. I mean, what would you say?
Right. I think what I would have said to myself was listen to that discomfort and act on it, right? Before, I mean, hindsight's 2020, and who's to know that, for sure, if I felt comfortable with like the lower compensation at the first school that I like legitimately like went through the application process with, like, who knows if ultimately they would have hired me, but presumably maybe they would have. There is a part of me that kind of wonders, okay, in the universe where I was kind of willing to trade the financial piece with something that was way closer to home and whatever. Is that like that version of me that did that? Is that, would that guy, he would have avoided all the stuff that kind of pushed me in this direction, but, would he be happy? I'll never be able to answer that question. But I think to some degree, the fact that throughout the entirety of this year, I've been really glad that I get to make my own schedule and I've got the flexibility to do what my kids need. Like even this week, unfortunately, my daughter was not feeling well and had to stay home from school. And instead of it being this weird sort of tug of war between myself and my wife, who's going to stay home, with the sick kid, I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm home anyway.
It's wonderful.
So,
Yeah.
in that sense, I think the comfort and just the ease with which, I've accepted kind of, okay, I'm going to figure this out. That sort of validates that the decision was the right decision, even if I can kind of contemplate had I recognized that I needed to get out sooner and, had applied to more, more jobs, maybe something would have happened and I'd, be doing this work at some other school. I
Sure.
don't know.
So I'm curious now about if someone listening to this is in that in-between place, feeling undervalued, feeling the friction, but still hesitating to move, what would you want them to understand about that moment that they're in right now? And you can certainly speak from a personal experience.
I it all depends on sort of where, what folks sort of situations are. I really do know how lucky I am that I could sort of take this gamble on myself, for lack of a better way of putting it. Um, but I think if you're in a position like I was, where you sort of recognize that the decision makers, for lack of a better phrase, like don't value you in the way that you know in your heart and believe that you should be valued, I think you have to listen to that voice and get yourself into a position where you feel valued and seen for who you are. For my former colleague, that's what happened for him when he went to direct a college office at a different school. And so I think it's about listening to that voice and betting on yourself that what you have to offer really is worth it. And that while again, if you're able to to make that change, then, invest in yourself and make that change.
Well said. Did the decision feel sudden when it finally came for you, or was it more like something you had slowly been coming to accept for a long time?
Sort of like it was both, right? In the sense that as that most recent job search kind of ran its course and it, dawned on me like, oh, like I don't have the next step, right, in another school. The next step is working for me, right? That did sort of hit me all of a sudden. But that voice saying, I can't keep working here, like that was sitting on my shoulder for years. So it was both a gradual thing and then a sudden thing, all at the same time.
I appreciate hearing that. So the work you're doing now, you're helping students and families find the right college fit. It's essentially the same mission,
Yes.
but does it feel different when you're doing it entirely on your own terms? And how does that feel for you on a daily basis? Because that's the emotion that you were seeking and you've got now.
Right. So I think to some degree, I can't really answer that question yet because, I don't have a large enough caseload that like all of my work feels like it's directed towards, right, the students that I'm working with. But I think what feels like the most authentic kind of reward is that when a family decides to work with me, they're choosing me. It's not that they've been assigned me through what I felt like was a really thoughtful process, but ultimately like assignments were made and they got me. And so, you know, some kids certainly were excited, right, that they got me. Other kids maybe, were, hiding some disappointment that they weren't working with somebody else. Other kids maybe less so. So in that sense, it is very much self-affirming that when, after some initial conversations, a family decides, yeah, we want you to partner with us in this process, like they're partnering with me. And that part of it is very, very gratifying, that they, sort of trust, right, that the way in which I lay things out to them is going to ease their anxiety and help make the process they're going through a smoother, better one. And so is incredibly rewarding because they're picking me.
Well said. What do you think people most often misunderstand about what it actually takes to leave something that looks successful from the outside?
This may sound cheesy, but back when I was a classroom teacher, I often had students ask me to sign their yearbook. And while from the outside, it's like, okay, I wasn't like writing anything really like specific and individual to any one student. What I wrote when I signed kids' yearbooks was, may you find success as you define it. And I think that's sort of the biggest shift, right? Of, from being successful because I worked at, right, such a well-renowned school, right, that I now get to define what success is for myself. In the early days, right, success is like, okay, if I have X number of students that I'm working with, right, is a way of defining it. But I think when I think about it in sort of in the totality, is like, I'm successful when, yes, I'm doing the right work for my students, my family, but also because I can be there to be the husband and partner that my wife needs and deserves, and that my kids can have the father that they need and deserve. And so that's that sort of kind of, I guess, 3-circle Venn diagram, sort of the professional work with getting this business to be a success, and then the home stuff, like that's where the focus is now.
Darren, I have to say, I'm impressed and struck by everything that you've shared. And I want to just take a moment here to acknowledge you and the work that you're doing, and really thank you for being here on Pivot Point Strategy for Change, because what stands out to me isn't that you just made a change. It's that you were willing to really pay attention to what was happening internally before you made it. You didn't ignore the frustration, the exhaustion, or the emotional weight of carrying something that no longer felt aligned. You actually allowed yourself to see it, acknowledge it. That's not easy for many people to do. And you pushed past it, because you mentioned earlier, many people ignore it. And that's really where things become worse for them in a lot of ways and over time. Many people minimize it. They stay where they are. And what you did was different. Even though the actions may have unfolded, you said it was gradually, but then quickly, which it oftentimes is because the decision is made. But that shift in the awareness, that moment where you recognize, this isn't working for me anymore, and that's significant. That takes honesty, that takes courage, and it takes a willingness to expect more from yourself and from your life. And you followed through on it. You didn't just make a professional change, you made a personal one. The way you show up now for your family, for your clients, for yourself, that's different. And I think that matters more than anything, because the people you're working with now, they're not just getting someone who understands the college process from your years of experience. They're working with someone who understands transition, someone who's lived through uncertainty, who's made a difficult decision without having everything figured out, and who's coming out on the other side more aligned and willing to take that next step and that courage to continue. And that makes the work that you're doing much more meaningful. So I really want to acknowledge you for that. And again, really thank you for being here and sharing your story on Pivot Point Strategy for Change.
Well, yeah, very welcome. And I don't, like, from my perspective, while I'd certainly been thinking about all of the things that you asked me about, I wasn't articulating them in the way in which your questions sort of compelled me to do. And so there's a lot of sort of benefit from recognizing what's happening and then saying it out loud.
Yeah.
Is rather energizing. So thank you for that and the opportunities.
And now for those of you listening, I want to really highlight something in what Darren just shared, because this is how these pivot points actually happen, not all at once, but through a gradual build of awareness. And then a moment or a series of moments where you finally recognize what you've been feeling and decide to do something about it. And the question is, when that moment shows up for you, what are you going to do with it? As always, I leave you with the one question I like to leave when I conclude an episode. Think about it. What is your pivot point? Thank you for joining me. Good luck, and look forward to speaking to you again, Darren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate it.